A charity that Prince Harry helped build for 2 decades has now printed in its own filed accounts the exact cost of depending on him. And the part that I genuinely cannot stop thinking about is not the $136,000 shortfall tied to filming. It is the phrase that sits just below it on the same page, a governance diagnosis that calls a prince a single point of failure. Page 43 of Sentebale's annual report, the version filed with the Charity Commission and available to anyone with a browser, contains 2 entries that read like a before and after photograph. The first is a line item recording a shortfall of approximately $136,000 connected to filming related costs. The second, printed in the same column, is a risk assessment describing the charity's historic dependence on one high-profile patron as a single point of failure. Hold on to that detail, because everything I am about to walk through flows from those 2 lines sitting side by side in a legally filed document. Harry's public profile was sold for years as Sentebale's greatest fundraising asset. The trustees' own filed accounts now name dependence on that profile as the structural risk they must remove. That contradiction is not buried in a footnote. It is the architecture of page 43. If you are new here on Royal Verdict, hit subscribe so you do not miss any updates on this story. Now look, Sentebale was founded in 2006 by Prince Harry and Prince Siaiso of Lesotho. The original mission was to support children affected by the HIV and AIDS crisis in southern Africa. The name itself, Sentebale, means forget-me-not in Sesotho. And for most of its early life, the charity operated on a model that anyone in the non-profit world would recognize immediately. You attach a famous name to the cause, you host glittering events, you sell tables at polo matches and gala dinners, and the money flows in because donors are paying not just for the cause, but for proximity to that famous name. For years, honestly, it worked. Sentebale raised millions. The Polo Cups in particular became a signature fundraising vehicle, drawing sponsors and high net worth individuals who wanted to swing a mallet on the same field as a prince. Sources describe one early fundraising dinner in London, reportedly held at a private members club in Mayfair, where the room smelled of gardenias and old leather, and the waiting list for tables ran 3 pages long. Harry arrived late, which was apparently typical, and within 20 minutes, every silent auction lot had been claimed. One trustee reportedly turned to a colleague and said something to the effect of, "We could put him in a car park and they would still write checks." The model was elegant in its simplicity. Harry shows up, cameras follow, checks arrive. That phrase, or something very close to it, reportedly circulated among the fundraising team for years as a kind of private shorthand for why the charity's financial engine worked. But here is the thing about building a fundraising engine around a single celebrity. The engine only runs when the celebrity is present, willing and undamaged by controversy. And the moment any one of those conditions changes, the engine does not slow down gracefully. It stalls. What makes this so striking to me is that nobody inside the organization appeared to treat that dependency as a risk during the good years. It was treated as an advantage. The thing that would eventually threaten the charity was for almost 2 decades the thing that everyone celebrated about it. Sources describe the period between 2022 and 2024 as a slow-motion reckoning inside the charity's leadership. Harry's public life had become dramatically more complicated. The memoir, the documentary series with Netflix, the legal battles with tabloid publishers, the visible tension with the rest of the royal family, the move to Montecito that placed an ocean between the patron and the charity's London operations. None of that was Sentebale's doing, but all of it affected Sentebale's operating environment. Donors who once competed for polo tables began asking quieter questions. Reportedly, conversations among senior trustees began shifting from how do we leverage Harry's profile to how do we survive if Harry's profile becomes a net cost rather than a net benefit. That shift did not happen overnight. It happened meeting by meeting, quarter by quarter, as the numbers told a story that no amount of goodwill could rewrite. The way one person described it, there was a particular board meeting reportedly held over video call with trustees dialing in from London and Johannesburg, where a senior financial officer presented a single slide showing revenue attributed to patron-led events plotted against total income over the previous 5 years. The line did not just dip, it cratered. And the room, or the screen, went quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when the data confirms something everyone suspected but nobody had yet said out loud. That meeting, sources say, was the moment the conversation stopped being theoretical and started becoming operational. The question was no longer whether the model was sustainable. The question was how quickly they could build a replacement before the old model collapsed entirely. And the numbers from that conversation are now public. The $136,000 shortfall is specifically tied to filming-related expenditures. Now, the report does not name the project in granular detail, but what we can read from the filing is that costs were incurred in connection with content production that did not generate the anticipated return. Sources describe the situation as a planned media initiative, reportedly involving a professional crew and location shoots in Southern Africa that was expected to attract donor engagement and instead became an expense that the charity had to absorb. The way one person close to the production described it, the footage was beautiful, but the conversion pipeline never materialized, meaning the content was produced, but the donor engagement it was supposed to generate simply did not follow. $136,000 is not a catastrophic sum for a charity of Sentebale's size, but it is a precise sum. It is filed, it is audited, and it sits on a page where the charity's own trustees are simultaneously telling regulators that their governance model has a structural flaw. That is not a coincidence. That is not bad formatting. That is a narrative the trustees chose to present. I need to pause here because the phrase single point of failure deserves its own moment. This is engineering language. It comes from systems design, where it describes a component whose failure brings down the entire system. A server with no backup is a single point of failure. A bridge with one load-bearing cable is a single point of failure. When a charity's board borrows that phrase and prints it in a regulatory filing, they are not being casual. They are not reaching for a metaphor. They are telling the Charity Commission and every future donor who reads the document that the organisation was architecturally dependent on one individual to a degree that constituted a governance risk. The individual is not named in the risk line itself, but when you read page 43 in context, the connection requires no decoder ring. The patron whose events generated the revenue is the same patron whose single point dependency the trustees are now flagging as a structural problem they must engineer out of the system. And this is where it changes, because before that phrase appears, you can read the $136,000 shortfall as simple bad luck, a filming project that did not land, a media bet that did not pay off. Every charity makes them. After that phrase appears, the shortfall stops being an isolated incident and starts being an exhibit. It becomes evidence of what happens when the single point fails, even partially. The filming cost was not just an expense, it was a symptom of the design flaw the trustees had already diagnosed. That reframing is the midpoint of this entire story. Everything before it is about a charity and its famous patron. Everything after it is about an institution trying to survive its own design. Honestly, the way this is described by people close to the board, the decision to print both items on the same page was deliberate. Not in the sense of a political hit, but in the sense of institutional documentation. Trustees wanted a record. They wanted the filed accounts to show that they had identified the risk and that they had a concrete recent example of that risk materializing. One former advisor to a similar charity told me that this is exactly what a responsible board does when it is preparing to restructure. You document the problem in regulatory filings so that the restructuring has a paper trail of justification. The Charity Commission, which is the regulator that oversees charitable organisations in England and Wales, expects trustees to identify and mitigate significant risks. Printing the single point of failure diagnosis in the annual report is not just candid. It is, in regulatory terms, evidence of good governance. The trustees are showing the regulator that they see the problem and that they have a plan. Now let me walk through what that restructuring looks like in practice, because the numbers tell the second half of the story. Under new leadership, Sentebale has undertaken approximately £1 million in annualised cost reductions. That figure does not appear as a single line item. It emerges from comparing operational expenditures across consecutive filings and following the trend lines that the charity's own financial summaries make visible. Staff costs down, event costs down, travel and hospitality down. The expensive polo match fundraising model quietly scaled back and, in practical terms, largely discontinued as a primary revenue driver. In its place, the charity has been building what the non-profit sector calls a diversified revenue base. That means grants from institutional donors, partnerships with government agencies and multilateral development organisations, recurring giving programs tied to specific projects rather than to celebrity access, and corporate partnerships structured around measurable impact rather than social cachet. The goal, reportedly articulated in an internal strategy document that circulated among trustees in late 2024, was to ensure that no single revenue source accounted for more than 30% of total income. That threshold is a standard benchmark in charity governance. It is also, by implication, an admission that the previous model had blown past that threshold for years. What most coverage missed is that this is not a pivot born out of scandal. This is a pivot born out of arithmetic. The trustees looked at the revenue concentration, looked at the risk it created, and decided that the charity's survival required reducing its dependence on celebrity-driven event fundraising. The fact that the celebrity in question is Prince Harry makes it dramatic. The underlying logic is the same as any business that realises 80% of its revenue comes from one client and decides that is an unacceptable risk. But the detail that matters is how that decision lands on Harry personally. Sources describe his reaction to the governance diagnosis as complicated. Not angry exactly, not indifferent, but something closer to the private discomfort of being told that the thing you built now needs to be rebuilt to survive without you. Reportedly, a close associate used the phrase professionally painful to describe how Harry processed the shift. One person who spoke with him during this period described a conversation in which Harry sat quietly for a long moment, reportedly turning his phone over and over on the table, before saying something to the effect of, "I always thought the work spoke for itself." That line, if accurate, reveals a specific kind of misunderstanding. Harry apparently believed that his value to Sentebale was the fieldwork, the visits, the personal connection with children in the programs. The trustees' diagnosis suggests that his actual value, at least financially, was his celebrity, which is a different thing entirely. The work may have been genuine. The funding model was built on the fame, and when the fame became complicated, the funding model cracked regardless of whether the work continued. He had poured genuine emotional investment into Sentebale. The charity's work in Lesotho and Botswana was not a branding exercise for him. People who worked alongside him in the field describe a prince who remembered children's names between visits, who sat on the floor during counselling sessions in a room that smelled of chalk dust and disinfectant, who got red dirt on his boots in a way that the usual royal visit choreography does not allow for. The idea that his involvement had become the thing the charity needed to manage, rather than the thing the charity needed to celebrate, was, by all accounts, not an easy message to receive. I want to sit with that for a moment because it contains a genuine human tension that no spreadsheet can capture. You can care deeply about something and still be the risk that threatens it. Those two things are not contradictory. They are, honestly, the core of what makes this story more than a financial audit. Harry did not wake up one morning and decide to become a liability. He woke up every morning being exactly who he had always been, a prince with a complicated public life, and the institution around him slowly recalculated what that meant for its survival. The man did not change, the math changed. Now, there is a counter read that deserves real weight here, and I want to place it precisely because it matters to understanding the full picture. Celebrity-driven events do not just raise money on the night, they generate media coverage, donor introductions, and long-tail engagement that can produce donations months or even years after the event itself. A polo match that costs more than it raises in ticket sales might still be a net positive if the press coverage brings in $300,000 in subsequent donations from people who saw the event on television or read about it in a lifestyle magazine. The trustees' diagnosis of single point of failure dependency may be structurally correct while simultaneously understating the total value that the celebrity model generated over 2 decades. One charity finance consultant I spoke with made the point that you cannot easily separate the halo revenue from the event revenue when a patron is as high profile as Harry. Every grant application that mentioned his name, every corporate sponsor that signed because of the association, every individual donor who first heard of Sentebale through press coverage of a polo match, all of that is downstream value that does not appear in the event line item. And here's the tension that cuts even deeper. The The dependency may not have been Harry's design at all. He did not build the charity's financial model. He did not set the fundraising strategy. He did not decide that polo matches should be the primary revenue vehicle. He showed up, he lent his name, he did the work on the ground. The decision to concentrate revenue around his profile was an institutional choice made by successive boards and executive directors who found it easier to sell tables at a Prince's polo match than to build a diversified donor pipeline from scratch. If Sentebale became dangerously dependent on one patron, the question of who created that dependency is not as simple as pointing at the patron. That tension does not resolve. It sits in the filed accounts like an open question that the trustees have chosen not to answer. What the trustees have answered in precise financial language is what the dependency cost when it stopped performing, $136,000 in filming-related shortfall. That number is modest enough to absorb, but large enough to document. And the governance diagnosis that accompanies it transforms a manageable loss into a case study in institutional risk. Let me describe what the restructured Sentebale looks like, because the contrast with the old model is striking. The charity's new leadership has reportedly implemented a grants-first strategy, meaning the primary revenue targets are institutional funders, government bodies, and multilateral organisations rather than individual high-net-worth donors attracted by celebrity events. The staff structure has been streamlined. The London office, which sources describe as having operated with the overhead profile of a much larger organisation, complete with dedicated event coordinators, media staff, and a hospitality budget that one person described as eye-watering for a charity of that size, has been significantly reduced. Program delivery in Southern Africa continues, but the cost of running the London-based fundraising and administrative apparatus has been cut by roughly a third. One person familiar with the restructuring described it as removing the stage and keeping the mission. That phrase landed with me because it captures something real about how charities evolve when they outlive their founding model. The stage was the galas, the polo cups, the red carpet moments that put Sentebale in the press. The mission was the children in Lesotho and Botswana who needed counselling, education and healthcare support. For 20 years, the stage funded the mission. Now, the trustees have concluded that the stage itself became a cost centre and a governance risk, and the mission needs a different funding mechanism to survive. Reportedly, the new chief executive conducted what staff internally referred to as a line-by-line review, going through every budget category and asking a simple question. Does this serve the mission or does this serve the profile? The hospitality budget was cut. The events calendar was reduced from 7 or 8 marquee functions a year to 2 or 3 smaller gatherings with institutional partners. The media team was restructured to focus on impact reporting for grant applications rather than celebrity-adjacent press coverage. One staff member reportedly described the mood in the office during the transition as funereal, not because anyone disagreed with the logic, but because the old Sentebale had been, honestly, a glamorous place to work, and the new Sentebale was going to be a quieter, more austere operation focused on spreadsheets and grant deadlines rather than seating charts and polo fields. Honestly, there is something almost architectural about reading the filed accounts with this lens. You can see the old structure and the new structure occupying the same document. The shortfall is the old structure cracking, the cost reductions are the new structure being poured, and the single point of failure diagnosis is the engineering report that explains why the old structure could not hold. I keep coming back to page 43 because the juxtaposition is so precise. Above the governance line, a specific dollar amount representing a specific failure of the celebrity-driven model. Below it, a structural diagnosis that reframes the charity's entire 20-year operating history as a risk that accumulated year by year, event by event, polo match by polo match, until the trustees had no choice but to name it publicly. The shortfall is the receipt, the diagnosis is the verdict, and they sit together in a document that anyone can download from the Charity Commission's website. What strikes me most is the institutional courage it takes to print something like that. Charities depend on public trust. Naming your most famous patron as a structural risk in a regulatory filing is not something you do casually. It suggests a board that has decided the long-term credibility of the institution matters more than the short-term comfort of the relationship. Whether Harry was consulted before the language was finalised is something I cannot confirm. Sources close to the process say only that the filing went through the standard trustee approval process, which would typically involve a final review meeting where every member of the board